my name is Rebeccah Brann, and I'm a teacher here at Covenant Ballet, and I've been asked to interview Miss Marla on achieving 35 years of having a dance company and a studio. And I think they asked me because I was here when it began. I was little, but I was here taking classes as a 6-year-old. So Miss Marla, how do you feel having achieved this milestone?
It's pretty incredible. I cannot believe it's already been 35 years. But what's really sweet is now we're seeing the second generation, and I have been teaching and enrolling my students' kids, and that's really pretty amazing. So that's a sweet piece of this 35.
So can you tell us what made you start this studio in South Brooklyn? Like, why here? Why not Manhattan?
When I moved from out of college, I moved right into Sheepshead Bay. And I remember thinking, this is kind of odd. We're in southern Brooklyn, but there doesn't seem to be any real serious ballet school. I had to, and as all dancers do, they trek into Manhattan to take all their classes. So when 2 years into my life here, when I decided to actually make the change to open up a school, when I had discovered my teaching capabilities and that I really loved it, I said, I think there was a need. And so we had to meet this, I wanted to meet this need. And people would tell, why don't you open it in northern Brooklyn? I was like, no, the need is here. So I began on Sheepshead Bay Road in a tiny little studio, really tiny. And then after about 1.5 to 2 years, we moved into in the same building into a slightly bigger
It
studio.
had been a photography studio.
Yes.
And so it had like a little platform that you got rid of, but it had this really cool brick wall.
Yes.
So
and the high ceilings.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if a lot of you were there close to the beginning, but not like the very first year it started, you would remember that studio.
Yes. With the pillar in the middle.
Right
of the
in the
studio.
middle.
Which I bumped into multiple times.
So many times. So many times. And we ended up covering it with carpet.
Yes.
It was not covered with carpet for the first 7 years.
It was terrible.
We just were being risky. And then you used it in performances, like it became a character. Wasn't it like the clock for?
Yes. It was actually Charles Loring Brace. When we couldn't get the actual dancer or the actor there, I would have the kids run around the pillar. But the funniest part was when we went to the stage, they didn't have a pillar. So they weren't running around the dancer or the actor. And I had to yell at them, no, around him.
So like the actor is standing here, and instead of running around him, they're running around the imaginary pillar person.
It was very funny.
Yeah, right. So you're from Hawaii.
Yes.
And you moved to Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. Look, I love Sheepshead Bay. But Hawaii to here, tell us a little bit about how you started dancing, how you ended up here.
That's what everybody asks me. I started dancing when I was 6. My mother in Hawaii wanted me to do an extracurricular activity, and so she took me to a hula lesson, and then she took me to a ballet lesson, and she said, which one do you want? And I said, I think I want that ballet one. So she started taking me to class every Saturday, because the ballet teacher would fly in from Oahu, an outer island, plant herself in the morning on Saturday morning, teach all her ballet classes, and fly out. And after a few years, I didn't want to continue, but my mom realized it wasn't because of the ballet, it was because possibly the teacher. She had found out another teacher had moved on the island and was about to open up a school, and she approached her, and I took a class with Mrs. Danford, Emily Danford, and my life changed. I love that one. I'm gonna cry. She talked about the ballet. She talked about the ballerinas. She had books about it. I scoured the libraries. I became a complete ballerina. And I danced with her all the way through high school, and then decided to go to the University of California, Irvine, for a bachelor's in dance, and decided at the end of that I wanted to be a professional dancer, and that every dance company goes through New York City. So I particularly wanted to be a Graham dancer, a Martha Graham dancer. So I came to New York, and that's how I ended crazily in Sheepshead Bay in South Brooklyn, and started to look around and say, this is very interesting, very different culture here when it comes to ballet. So
You have a lot of like Miss Nina's ballet school and Happy Tappy Feet.
yes.
So the format of those classes is not something where professional dance can really be taught. They're like in 15-minute increments.
Yes, I had never heard of the combination classes. I had never heard of competitions. And yes, I grew up in what I guess would be considered a recital school, but she had a lot of integrity, and she was only ballet. So I didn't understand the programming here and the methodology of teaching. So when I did open the school, I said, I want to be different. I want to make sure that we give them more of a conservative style programming, that they got true classical ballet training, they got true modern, whether it's Graham-based or Horton-based or whatever style of modern, that they could increase their movement base, and opened it here. And not everybody's going to be a ballerina, but that doesn't mean you can't dance and be a professional.
Yeah.
So that was my aim, because I wasn't going to discriminate on anybody who comes in. So whoever comes in, we'll have to figure out how we can make this work for them if their bodies had trouble with the classical ballet
You
style.
always work with the dancer. Sometimes we've had dancers that you've had to talk to because their feet and ankles you just didn't think were appropriate for point work. Can you tell us about any of those situations, and if they ended up getting the strength to move on to point, or if, we've talked about it over the years that we are in South Brooklyn and we don't tend to get the hypermobile ballerina type. So what have you done adaptations to the way you teach, or have you adapted the way you teach based on our clientele?
Yes. Part of that was early on realizing that you cannot strengthen the body if they're only coming once a week. So the demand on their time had to be much more, because in order for them to build the muscle strength, we opened it, we tried to find other means. So I implemented a lot of conditioning work during our summer programs. We implemented a program called SKIP, which is Strengthening, Conditioning, and Injury Prevention, to try to manage
She
kids.
loves a good acronym.
Yes, I do. And so that we can
Balance out their bodies.
Yes. Once they understood that they could continue to improve and progress in the levels of the ballet, regardless of whether they wore point shoes or not, it made them feel better. Of course, you had those, which were often sad, that when they weren't allowed, their hearts broke, because that, dancing on the tips of their toes meant
ballet.
a lot.
Yeah.
But I couldn't do it just because they wanted it, when they didn't know that their body would reject it, so that their physically would not be healthy for them.
You also implement the ABT teaching curriculum here at the studio?
Yes. I had heard about, went to a meeting at the Joyce Theater when they were starting to roll out the possibility of this.
ABT was rolling it out?
And Raymond and Franco were there, and they had this talk back, and just this little seminar, just talk back about this curriculum that they were working on, and I thought, this sounds incredible. And after a few years, and a couple of my teachers actually going in and getting the certification, I decided it was time. And when I sat through that curriculum program, or the seminar, or the certification process, I just was so ecstatic. All those years of trying to figure it out on my own, looking at Royal Academy of Dance, thinking about Vaganova, thinking about the Cicchetti Probe Society and the programming, and where do I start? Where do I go? How do I take the best of all? They had done it. It was amazing. And it was so in sync with my my methodology, and it just blended. And
Yeah.
so I took it, was certified, and haven't looked back. And it was just absolutely wonderful. Yes, so, you know, in South Brooklyn, it's an incredibly diverse neighborhood and metropolis. And you get all kinds of body
I've
types.
heard the expression here for this area, like, it's not a melting pot, it's a salad bowl.
Yeah.
Because everybody maintains their ethnic identities and cultural,
Interesting.
so
Yeah.
it's just a nice mix.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful, that's certainly represented here.
Absolutely. And I think everybody who's walked in has felt comfortable. It hasn't been, because it's not, I'm not expecting, and this is a funny thing to say, I'm not expecting to make professional dancers. That's their responsibility, because I have no control over their life and what circumstances will evolve to make this person get to that point. But I can give them all the tools. I can give them the education and the love of the art form. And so what they do with it later is up to them, but they'll have it the rest of their lives. And so I think everybody who walks in feels that. And what's really funny is we have the harmony of interest to watch a dance performance, and all these kids, ages, sizes, ethnicities, everything, they're all coming together, they're chattering, and I have to yell at them to stop chattering, but during rehearsals, and it also brings the families together, to where I've had students who are moving, and the mothers are crying in the lobby to me to tell me because they don't want to leave.
Yeah.
Not even their kids, they don't want to leave, and how
Another-
much they miss us.
Another
So,
mother, years ago when I was a kid, spoke about her love of the studio and that she wanted to relocate, but she couldn't, because where would she send her kids to
Yeah.
dance?
so sweet, and that's why
I'm
we
not
all.
gonna name drop, but you know who you are.
I think also that is why there have been times where we've had kids who've moved to Long Island, moved to Queens, and they tried their hardest
They did.
to continue coming back here. Yeah, it's a sweet family and a sweet community that we've built here.
So, what is your cultural identity, and has it influenced any of the teaching that you've done or choreography?
I am a full Japanese American, born and raised in Hawaii. All my roots are still there as far as all my family, and except for the occasional, annual events and certain national holidays that are still celebrated in Japan or that were brought on to the culture in Hawaii. That was pretty much it. I don't even speak Japanese.
But you eat spam wasabi.
No, musubi, spam musubi. That's a very Hawaii.
Oh, okay.
Hawaii local food. Yes, I admit I like spam. Because my father was a World War II veteran. He was one of the first Nisei, Nisei means Japanese American, by the way, second generation Japanese American. So it really wasn't until I wanted in 2001, I wanted to do a ballet about World War II. And I was planning to do it about three men, a Brooklyn-born, someone from Hawaii, and someone from the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to do their three stories. And then I was talking to my costumer, and I said, yeah, and then, a Japanese guy from Hawaii, Carl Oliveri. And he said, wait a minute. The Japanese fought on our side? Don't you mean the Japanese we fought the Japanese? And I said, no. And then
There was an education opportunity.
Yes. And then I realized, and then a good friend of mine said, Marla, you need to focus on that because nobody knows that story. And I was like, you're right, okay. And so I shifted everything, and I went back to an interview that I had done with my father. He was already in the Army when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he was the first battalion that was sent overseas to fight for America in Germany, and in Europe, in Italy. And they were called the 100th Battalion. And when my dad was drafted, they took away his guns, they took away everything until they decided there was somebody in the higher ups that finally said, let's give these guys a chance, and so he did. He was injured in Italy, in Monte Cassino, and came back having lost his left eye. So I grew up, my dad was he was a ham. You could get him to dance and make you laugh without a drink. He loved to do it. He would put on his golf cleats and pretend to tap dance. He would take my wig and he would pretend to be Tiny Tim and the ukulele and sing. He was a crazy guy with his glass eye, and we have so many stories about his glass eye. And so I took components of that story, put it into my ballet, and I created the ballet. And my sister and my mom came and saw it, and they loved it. My father had already passed away by then. So we did it as a memorial to him and all his comrades. And then during that research time, learning about kimonos, learning about
And you
the
had
culture.
to learn how to put one on.
Yes, I had to learn how. Yes, and oh my, there's so much to that. It was crazy, and how to walk in it. There was just so much I learned.
Small steps.
Yes, you're not supposed to let the seam open. It was just, there's so many things. It was just really wonderful touchstone to my culture that I had never had taken the time to do.
All right, so we've been doing this little interview because we're celebrating 35 years, and one of our many followers had for us was, which came first? Was this a dance company first, or was it a school? How did you end up meshing the two? And tell us about that a little bit.
Okay, I think Balanchine's words, "school first," was way back in my brain. But I decided, I had been already doing some dabbling in choreography. Oddly enough, it really wasn't my favorite thing to do. But I had already started, and then when I began the school, after seeing the need and realizing my gifts as a teacher, after the first year in 1987 into 1988, I realized, oh, I didn't have a performance. And I realized, I have to do something for these kids. What am I going to do?
We're not a recital school.
Right, I don't want to. I guess then the artist in me just didn't want to put on little pieces of dances for the kids that I had. So I decided I needed to tell my own story. So I took a dear friend and mentor to lunch one day, asking him to help me kind of write a story. And I had a little bit of an idea that was germinating, and then he kind of helped me formulate it. And it allowed me to use my kids at the time, who were very young, and I didn't have a lot of them, and then incorporate professional dancers that I had been dancing with. So the heirloom.
How big would you say your student body was at that point? This was like the second year.
The
that
second
you
year.
had been open.
I'm guessing 20, 30 kids at the most, not even.
Are
So,
you still, I think we're still in touch with most of those.
oh, yeah. In fact, the girl who was the lead in it was a young girl named Julie, and she played my lead girl who gets a doll for her birthday. She has starts off in the birthday party. And Julie went off to, they moved to New Mexico, but she went off to become a dancer and a chemist. Go figure.
And I think she's still doing both.
Yes, she's amazing with twin boys. And so anyway, yeah, that began a journey where I began to just write my own ballets every other year. It was way too big of a project to do it every year. So we did it every other year. And it wasn't until probably 2000, 2001 or so that I began to do a production every year.
What was it that made you want to do your own ballet lines? Like, why didn't you want to do what had been done?
Because a lot of the classical ballets that are already done require a much higher technical capability. And it's particularly in the beginning, I didn't have any girls on point, maybe two at the time. So it didn't seem appropriate, and that I just needed to be able to manage the levels and the storyline so I could have the different age groups and levels presented in the ballets. So that was my journey, and I found that I was actually pretty good at it, and I actually really liked it.
You've done video in your dances, you've done painting, you've done sets, you've had singers, live music, like not just singers, but live musicians. So you've been in business for 35 years as Covenant Ballet. Well, actually, it wasn't always Covenant Ballet.
Covenant Dance Studio.
And when did you change the name to Covenant Ballet?
In 2007, we were being evicted from our space for 20 years.
Not because we didn't pay the rent.
It's because they sold the building.
Had nothing to do with us.
Yes, and they said it was, you have to vacate. And I was at a crossroads. It was like, well, what do I do? Do I move on? Where do I go? And a sponsor stepped forward, and it was determined that I had been running it like a nonprofit. It's better to actually be a nonprofit.
You're not making money anyway. Might as well get the label.
So in 2007, we formed a incorporating board, and we became Covenant Ballet Theatre of Brooklyn. Very long name, but that's where it came from. So
CBTV.
yes.
And then we shortly after started junior company, and I wanted them to be called CBTV2, but that didn't go. Okay, anyway, I thought it was fun. So yeah, you've done a lot of ballets over the years. Do you think you could name them all in chronological order?
I probably could.
Okay. Do you have a favorite?
No. I think the problem is that when it's like my ballets are my babies, and every time I'm in the process of giving birth to a ballet, it becomes the favorite and the best one yet. This is the best one. It's gonna blow everybody away. This is the best one. So it's hard to look back. I think obviously the two that I hopefully will be most remembered by are my two historic ballets, and that's Orphan Train and Mise, that are both rooted in historic stories. And so those ballets are very, very special because those can come back very frequently. We keep kind of rotating those ballets more often than not. I came across this story, the Orphan Train, through my accountant at the time. And Ellen had gone on vacation, and she said, you know, I came back from, and they had this guy singing on a banjo, and he was singing about this thing called the Orphan Trains. And she said, have you ever heard of that, Marla? And I'm like, no. That sounds really intriguing. So I started to look it up and found Reverend Charles Loring Brace and his history, and couldn't believe that this was a story that's part of the New York history. It is the beginning of the New York Children's Aid Society story, and it's the first mass foster care movement in America. And it's grounded in this story about this man and how he took these waifs and orphans and abandoned children off the streets of New York City, put them on trains and found homes for them out in the Midwest. And it lasted for 75 years, from 1854 to 1929.
Huge success rate.
80% they say success rate. Of course, there were a lot of awful stories.
But what they would have experienced here on the streets.
Yes.
You know, it's similar misery.
Terrible. And so I started to create this ballet, and it came very easily. The storyline, and I, through a friend, found the music, and it was an immediate success. People loved it, and it put the kids, my students, the kids, center stage instead of having a professional be center stage.
Yeah.
Because it was about story about children and their life and how it was affected and changed. And so we have been able to use that, but the sweetest part was in 2000. Right before 2000, I found out about an orphan train rider survivor living in New Jersey, and he was going to speak in Rochester, New York. And so I immediately called, said, can I come? And they said, absolutely. I went to meet Arthur Smith, who has an incredible story. He was probably in his 60s or 70s at that time. And I met him and his wife, and they came to speak to my kids, met my kids who were performing their story. He was abandoned in Gimbel's department store as an infant. They thought maybe he was about a month old. They took him to the Children's Aid Society. He kind of went from foster home to foster home until he was about 5 years old. And a young girl that was targeted to be on the trains to head out west, Midwest, got sick. And so he took her place. And when they stopped in Iowa, he doesn't really remember this, but he thinks that this was his story, and they wrote about it in the Gazette or the newspaper in Iowa at the time. There was a couple that didn't come to adopt anybody. They came to actually just see what was going on. And as the kids were filing in, he looked up at them and he jumped on the man's lap and he said, "Will you be my daddy?" And that was it. They took him home. And they had one son, and she couldn't have any other kids, so they adopted Art. He was named, I believe, I can't remember what his Field. They named him Field. And so he thought that was his original name, but it turns out, they never knew who his original parents were. But his adopted name was Smith. And he and Georgiana met in New Jersey when he was a World War II veteran. She was a school teacher, and they got married, and they lived in Trenton. And so when we met, he came and talked his story to our people. He talked to the public school children, that when we would have our Arts and Ed program. And then in 2000, he hooked me up because the Children's Aid Society was having a reunion in Times Square at the Marriott Marquis. And we took excerpts of our ballet into Times Square, and we performed for the descendants and the orphan train rider survivors that attended. It was pretty phenomenal. So that was one of my dearest memories of that ballet.
Really special.
Very special. Sweet Piece was one of the years that we were performing it. One of my faculty members, Brenda Neville, was performing in it. And turns out she has a relative that in her family tree is also an orphan train rider. So the connections were pretty amazing. So very sweet piece.
And this is not as amazing, but it's pretty fun. One of our other faculty members does a lot of work with the Children's Aid Society.
Yes.
And he was, for many years, your Charles Loring Brace.
Yes, that's
So
true.
It's pretty fun.
That is very true.
So, tell me how you got into arts and education.
Okay.
Seems sort of niche.
Yes, it is. I began because I made a very good friend with a dancer who I used to take class with in the city. We met, and she approached me one day and said that the New York City Ballet Education Department was looking for teaching artists, and would I be interested? And I said yes. So I went to interview with Michelle Odette at the time, who was the head there, the director there, and she hired me, and I began to do I eventually ended up becoming the teaching artist for most of the District 22 schools, primary schools in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn is big.
Yeah, and District 22 though, and they were using the New York City Ballet Education Department's curriculum. It was wonderful, and I loved it. I loved meeting these kids at the door, getting them all looking at me like, what are we gonna do? And especially the boys.
We're not gonna do ballet.
Exactly. And then I had them, and by the end of the workshop, they were all dancing. It was just so much fun. I loved it. I did have hard experiences, but those are fun anecdotes too, where you walk in with a substitute teacher in Harlem and the kids all of a sudden are bouncing off the walls.
Yeah.
And a kid in a headlock. It's like, oh dear, I think we need to cut. We need to cut.
Help her, help her.
There were tough times, but I did it for a good 7 years. And after the 7 years, it was apparent that I could be doing this with my company. We had story ballets. I could link workshops with the story ballets, particularly Orphan Train, because it was that year. I think I had ended my time at New York City Ballet the year I created Orphan Train. And I had made a contact with the district office, someone in the district office, and began the series of arts and education performances of orphan training for the Brooklyn schools. And so it just kind of, the ball started to run, and it was wonderful.
And they were changing the curriculum over.
Yeah.
And so you got to be an heir to a wonderful curriculum.
Yeah.
So that was nice too.
That was really, really nice. You mean at New York City Ballet? Yes, absolutely. So that was
All
really,
year long.
yes.
Now, regarding this interview, Miss Marla, you've been open 35 years. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of things that we could be talking about. So maybe we'll do this again in 35 years.
Maybe. We'll see.
So please keep an eye out on our social media channels. We will be posting all of the fun things that we're going to be doing this year to celebrate 35. And if you're an alumni, like I am, and you want to get involved,
Our Alumni Association, which tends to meet and watch short clips of old videos.
yeah, get together with us on Zoom.
Yeah.
So there are lots of ways that we can stay connected this year, which is sort of a landmark year, right?
So thank you for joining us for this little interview, and jazz hands. Thank you, everybody, for 35 years. Pretty amazing.
Pointing the way.